In a forgotten corner of Judah, when kings ignored the scrolls and priests lost their fire, a woman rose. Not a warrior, not a queen, but a prophetess with thunder in her voice and heaven in her eyes. Her name, Hulda. Welcome to biblical stories, where hidden hearts, royal voices, and sacred destinies come alive through emotional, first-person narratives. These are not just stories. These are the diaries of women who changed history.
They came to me with scrolls in trembling hands, their royal robes stained by fear and dust, men with crowns yet hearts like children, desperate for truth when the silence of heaven was louder than war drums. And I, Hulda, daughter of Tikva, stood not with sword nor scepter, but with the unshakable weight of God's whisper burning in my chest. I was no noble by birth, no queen by marriage. But when the scroll was unrolled and the words of the Lord danced across ancient parchment like fire on dry leaves, it was my mouth heaven chose as its vessel, and I spoke not to flatter kings, but to awaken a nation numbed by idols and lulled by lies, for the scroll they found in the temple ruins was not just ink on papyrus, it was a mirror reflecting every sin they buried in shadows and silence, and when they asked, "What does the Lord say?" I did not tremble, I did not pause, I told them the truth. I remember the first time I felt the stir of prophecy, not in a temple, not during a sacrifice, but alone, washing linen under a fig tree, when the wind shifted and the weight of the unseen pressed on my bones, a presence both terrifying and tender, like a mother waking her child with urgency in her voice and fire in her eyes, and I learned then that holiness doesn't wait for ceremony. It crashes into ordinary moments like thunder breaking open blue skies. So I listened, again and again, even when others said prophecy belonged to men, even when priests frowned and neighbors whispered, I listened, because God's voice found me in places no crown would ever look, and that made me dangerous, sacred, and unshakable. When King Josiah's men entered my chamber, eyes wide, breath short, scroll in hand, I knew the time had come, not for me to rise, but for truth to rise through me. For years I had watched Judah crumble, watched altars rise to false gods while widows wept and children starved, and now the king was ready to hear, finally ready to feel the weight of disobedience not as history but as consequence, and though I was not robed in royal blue, the authority that filled the room was not theirs, it was heaven's, and it rested on me, a woman no one invited to the throne room, yet summoned by God to shake it. I read the scroll aloud, not just with my voice but with my heart, letting each word echo through the chambers of their pride and fear, reminding them that every line was a heartbeat of a covenant they had long abandoned, and as the weight of the law fell on them like stone, I could see their knees weaken, not from me, but from the God who had waited centuries for them to return, and it was then I saw it, that sacred collision between regret and hope, when the heart breaks just enough to let redemption in. They asked if judgment could be delayed, if mercy still breathed among us, and I closed my eyes not to escape, but to see clearer, to hear what silence might be saying beneath the noise of their guilt, and what I heard was this. The judgment would come, yes, but because Josiah's heart broke and he wept before the Lord, he would be spared the full storm, and as I delivered that message, I could feel both the sorrow and the strange mercy woven together like twilight, half night, half hope. Prophecy is not performance, it is burden, it is fire shut up in the bones, and once spoken, it cannot be undone. I carried that fire long after they left, long after the scrolls returned to their shelves, because speaking for God does not make life easier. It makes it heavier, sacredly heavier, like walking with thunder wrapped around your ribs and knowing every word you release might set a nation trembling or a soul free. I never asked for this calling, never lit a candle hoping to be found, but God found me anyway, in stillness, in silence, in the in-between spaces where women were rarely seen and almost never heard, and that's the wild holiness of our God. He speaks through who he wills, not who the world votes for, and I, Hulda, lived as proof that heaven does not check gender before it sends fire. There were days after that moment when I questioned if the words I spoke would truly turn the hearts of the people, when I saw idols still standing and heard laughter in temples meant for tears. But prophecy isn't measured by applause, it's measured by obedience, and sometimes, obedience looks like speaking when you'd rather remain hidden, loving truth more than being liked, planting seeds you may never live to see bloom. They remember the scroll, they remember the king's revival, but few remember the woman behind the message, the prophetess who dared to say, "This is what the Lord says," in a world that had forgotten his voice, and that's okay, Because legacy is not about being remembered, it's about being faithful, and I, Hulda, was faithful even when forgotten. So if ever you feel small, invisible, overlooked by systems and crowns, remember this. Heaven hears the humble, speaks through the willing, and lifts voices from the dust to declare divine things. You don't need a temple to be holy ground, you don't need a title to carry truth, and you don't need permission to be used by God, just a heart that listens and a soul brave enough to say yes.
If you are enjoying this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to help this channel reach more people. Now let's continue.
The years passed after Josiah's reforms, but my heart remained awake in the night, listening for God in the echoes of silence, wondering if the people would remain faithful after the king was gone, because that is the ache of a prophet. You don't just speak for today, you see into the future and grieve what hasn't happened yet, and I could feel it, like a storm behind a distant mountain, that they would forget again, that the hunger for idols would return. And yet I still prayed, still watched. The skies for answers, still kept the flame alive in my chest even when no one asked for light. People came to me sometimes, not kings or priests, just women with torn shawls and men with dust in their eyes, asking if God still saw them, if he still remembered their names in the middle of ruins and regret, and I would look into their eyes and say yes, not with thunder, not with vision, just with quiet assurance that the God who spoke the stars into place could still find them in the wreckage of their lives, because sometimes prophecy doesn't roar, it whispers. And healing doesn't begin with miracles, it begins with remembering you're still loved. I was never surrounded by crowds, never sat on thrones or walked marble courts, but heaven often prefers caves and kitchens, corners and courtyards, places where hearts are raw and the air is honest, and that's where I lived. Between scrolls and silences, waiting rooms of revelation, where I learned that God often hides his messengers in plain sight until the moment their voice becomes the hinge of history, and when he calls, he doesn't ask if you're ready, he asks if you're willing. There were nights when I doubted, when my voice felt too small against the weight of corruption and chaos, when I wondered if being a woman made me invisible in the eyes of men and if my obedience had any value at all, but then I'd remember the moment the scroll was placed in my hands and the way heaven rushed in like breath into dry lungs, and I knew. No matter how I felt, the truth I carried was divine, and my voice was chosen not by culture but by covenant. I did not wear priestly garments, did not burn incense before crowds, but I carried something far more sacred, a soul anchored in the word, a heart pierced by divine presence, and I guarded that fire not with ceremony but with intimacy, with prayers whispered before dawn and scriptures etched into memory like songs that never left. Because when you are called by God, your whole life becomes an altar, and every moment an offering. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had said no, if I had let fear convince me that my voice wasn't enough, if I had turned away from the scroll and let someone else speak softer words. But then I remember that obedience isn't just about courage, it's about surrender, and when I surrendered, I discovered a strength not born of self but of spirit. A wind that filled my lungs with purpose and turned my ordinary life into a vessel of the divine. I did not live for applause, for temples built in my name or songs sung in my honor. I lived for that sacred silence after the message had been spoken, when hearts broke open and heaven leaned close, for those moments when a nation paused just long enough to hear its own soul, and if even one tear led to repentance, even one king bowed low in truth, then my calling was worth every unseen sacrifice. They still speak of kings and wars, of temples and triumphs, but few remember the women who lit the path, who spoke when silence was safer, who prayed behind the walls and watched the heavens for signs. And yet, it is through these hidden ones that God so often moves, through Hulda and others like me, whose voices echo not in monuments but in moments of awakening, in the still places where truth finds those who are ready to change. I write this not for fame, not for legacy, but for those who feel unseen, unworthy, unsure if their voice matters. Let this be your sign. God does not wait for perfect lips, he looks for yielded hearts, and if he could speak through a woman hidden in the corners of Jerusalem, he can surely speak through you, right where you are, with your brokenness, your fear, your quiet courage, because his fire doesn't need permission, it just needs a spark. And now, as my final days draw near, I look back not with regret, but with reverence, for the scroll I read, the fire I carried, the truth I dared to speak when the world had forgotten it, and I offer this story not as a monument but as a mirror, that you too might see your place in the divine narrative, that you too might say yes when he calls, and if this journey has moved your soul even slightly, stay close, more stories await. More voices are rising from the dust, and heaven is not finished speaking.
For those who hear echoes of their own story in Hulda's quiet strength, there is more waiting. Subscribe to Biblical Stories and continue walking through the sacred pages where the unseen are remembered and the unheard finally speak.